Oh, hello, friends. I hope you're all having a wonderful day. Yeah, it's a little late, and but I wanted to get this video done today. Um, Even though it's a little late, I hope you don't mind. So your view is going to be a little dark, but there's never really very much going on in the scenery. Anyway, um, the important thing is that we want to get on with the series because we got a lot of important things to talk about. Vastly important, friends, because we've been lied to so very much. And we have, not been allowed to know the true story about Jesus and who he really was. We haven't really been given the information so that we can make sense of our world. So that's what we have to do. We have to figure out what it all means. So in the last video, we were talking about Rome being Capitol Hill, where the Lord was crucified. And I'm certain that probably many of you, if not all of you, are finding that to be very, very astonishing. I mean, we already had been talking about some very amazing things. In many of the videos that we've been covering, we're just getting into it deeper and deeper. I said we weren't going to eventually start talking about the Merovingian kings and the king line and up into France and Mary Magdalene going into Europe. And we're going to get into that today. But we've been, discovering some amazing things where the real Jerusalem really was and how Israel, the 12 tribes, really isn't what we thought. We discovered that the Bible is very clear that the Jerusalem that was at that day in those times, the temple of Herod, was really the temple of Edom, of the Edomian kings, the Hasmonean kings of Herod. And we've talked about how the temple we talked about how Paul said that Jerusalem that was then, that they lived in that era of, was the temple of Hagar. And we explained how Hagar was one of the wives of Abraham. Abraham had 3 wives, Sarah, Keturah, and Hagar. And we talked about how Hagar had a son named Ishmael. She had 12 children. Well, those 12 children are a type of the 12 tribes. And according to the Apostle Paul, as we've said, that's the Jerusalem that is now. So it's really, really ironic that today Judaism and our present concept of Israel is following after a scenario or a Jerusalem that is now a different people. Yes, they're the children of Abraham. But, and remember, as we said, Hagar was given a bottle of water and a little pouch of some bread and stuff that she took off with Ishmael. And, she took off walking. She didn't get very far. And the angel said, I'm going to also make you a great nation. Well, she went down, according to Paul, the Apostle Paul, she went to Arabia. And there they set up a kingdom called the kingdom of Edom in Mount Seir. From various places in the Old Testament, we find that that's the very same mountain that Ishmael, it says in the story, Edom, or Esau, this is another one of his names, he marries Ishmael's sister. And so they kind of form a union. And so Ishmael and Esau then are the very same people. And then later on, we see that they're actually the same people as the Midianites. We talked about in one of my videos that we've made some time ago, we talked about how when Joseph was sold to the Egyptians, in one place it says he was sold to the Midianites, in another place he was sold to the Ishmaelites, because they're the same people. And you'll find that everywhere it talks about their religion, in any one of these Midianites, Ishmaelites, or Edom, they're all worshiping at the same place, in Edom or at the mountain of Seir. And then we talked about how the present day Judaism really did come from the priesthood of Esau, because that priesthood produced a lineal line of priests called Jethro. Now, one of Jethro's names was Ruel, and one of them is Jethro. Again, it's interesting how there's always these play on words. We've got Jacob and we've got Israel. So the spiritual is always with the L, and the more carnal is always with the Yah. So the two names, there's always the two names. We got Mount Horeb, we got Mount Sinai. Sinai is the lower carnal mountain where all the laws of the Ten Commandments and all that came. And we've got Mount Horeb, which means light, orb, or light, and all of that. And so here also we've got two names for this priest, Ruel and Jethro. Well, it's Jethro that creates the entire priesthood of the Jews today. The Ten Commandments and the entire idea of the Aaronic priesthood and having a priest as a go-between between God and men, that came from the instructions of Jethro. But you see, even Jethro knew the truth, as Moses did. Moses went up on Mount Horeb, got the law of liberty and light and love. He saw God, which is light, and it was so amazing that just being in God's presence, it made Moses shine so that the people couldn't even look upon him. And they couldn't bear that light. And so then he goes up to another mountain, Mount Sinai, and brings down this law written on stone tablets, which the Apostle Paul says representing our stony heart. So all of these symbols in the Bible are pointing to this fact, that the Israel that was in the days of the New Testament, that where Jesus was preaching to them and condemning these Pharisees and this religion and telling them that your father's the devil and this is not my kingdom, fits perfectly with what the Apostle Paul is saying and the other apostles. Peter talks about we've approached to Mount Zion, a heavenly Jerusalem, a higher Jerusalem. See, but the Jerusalem that is now, and even today, is based on this carnal concept of the law, and everybody's thinking, oh, we got to go back to the law, and we're still not, the veil still hasn't been removed from the minds. The Apostle Paul says to this day, the veil that Moses wore, that hid the face of our Father in heaven, the light, this is when they're reading the Torah, the veil is still upon their minds. They don't understand the truth, the spiritual intent. So there's the physical and the spiritual. And so the real Israel then is going to be something greater. Jesus started his ministry, and for 3.5 years he began to build up this temple. He says, tear this temple down, and in 3 days I'll raise it up. And so we talked about how the real temple is the gathering of the lost tribes of Israel, which is the real, true Israel. And the 144,000 stones that are building up that great spiritual temple. So, down in the days of Christ in his ministry, he was ministering to a lower condition of mankind under this bondage and under the law. And so, as Paul says, the temple that is now and the Jerusalem that is now corresponds to Ishmael and the 12 tribes that's the physical and the carnal. So, then we talked about how, and some of the videos that we've been doing, we've been trying to explain how Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were actually pharaohs. And they lived down in Egypt, and they made King David made a monument right there where the temple, where Jerusalem was when he conquered that hill of Moriah, which we talked about was Mur, the Egyptian Mr or Mor or Moriah, actually means the great temple, which is patterned after something much greater. The Mount Meru in Africa is not even the greatest. It's not even the beginning, because originally, 16,000 years ago, mankind was in the age of Atlantis, or Lemura. And so the Lemurians were the people that existed in the light. That's the great, amazing kingdom and the mountain of God. And then we went down into the darkness for thousands of years. And Christ, there on the horizon, begins to rise. And we're going forward. And the phoenix shall rise out of the ashes. That's the Enoch, before the flood, the teachings of Enoch. So that great pyramid that's there in Egypt is also just a pattern. Today, it's what all the other temples and religions are patterned after. And even we talked about Japan having a Mount Moriah and a religion closely resembling Israel with priests in white robes, and they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And they got the samurai priests, which is from Samaria. And, all the things that we've discussed in many of these videos, and all the kingdoms of the earth. The Greeks have Mount Olympus, which is El, and the Elohim on the mountain, and around the mountain is the 12 tribes, or the 12 Olympiads. And every nation on earth goes back to these ancient teachings. But in this day and age, everything begins there with the temple that Solomon built, and where David was, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is after the flood, and it all was right there in Egypt. As we said, the Atlantis was in another place altogether. And as the prophet Joseph Smith said, it was there in America. And there's a lot more that we're going to get into to explain how the 12 tribes go in a circle around the center, the geographical center of the earth, which is at the Great Pyramid. And that's at that cave Machpelah, which means the unfolding circle, the center of the earth. And so Israel, like spokes in a wheel, they conquered the land, which is the whole earth. And it did it in stages. And we're going to find that one of the tribes that is called Gad, we're going to find out where they are today. There's a story in your Bible about Jesus. It's actually in Mark chapter 4, and it's in Luke as well. But there's a story where Jesus, we talk about this all the time. Jesus gets in the boat. And just before he gets in this is the story where Jesus is sleeping in the boat, right? And the waves came up and there was a great tempest. And they said, "Why are you sleeping? We're about to perish, Well, there's something that's probably the best part of the story, with the spiritual significance about Christ in the boat, which is sleeping in us, and he wakes up and calms the winds, and we can all do this when we have this recognition of Christ and when Christ awakens in us. But another interesting, it's so amazing how the Bible is written, because it on the surface, the letter of it, it's just a story that means really nothing. But then when we start breaking it down and finding all the different meanings, in one sense, it's a parable about some history that you probably have never heard in your entire life, and yet it's been right there. What you didn't notice is that when they get in the boat, just before they take off, Jesus tells them, because they didn't believe in him, and he says they sought a sign. They said, "We want a sign if you say you're the Messiah or the Christ." He says, "You will not receive a sign. A wicked and perverse generation seeks a sign, but I will give you a sign," Jesus said. "I will give you the sign of Jonah." Well, many people think, oh, okay, so he's talking about the sign of Jonah in the belly of the whale for 3 days and 3 nights, and he's saying, you're all going to see the sign. I'm going to die and go down under the grave and through hell, and 3 days I'm going to raise my body up, and that's going to be the sign. Well, yes, in some sense, maybe. But that's not exactly what Jesus was saying, because immediately after he says that, he gets in a boat. Well, what did Jonah do? Jonah got in a boat. Remember that? And he went across the sea. Well, Jesus said, you will see, I'm going to give you a sign, the sign of Jonah. And then he says, all right, disciples, get in the boat and let's go. Well, most people think he gets in the boat and they're going on the Sea of Galilee. Well, it doesn't say that. The word there isn't lake. I mean, we call it the Sea of Galilee probably because we've just assumed that this sea was the Sea of Galilee. So we call it the sea, but it's really just a lake in a sense. It's a big lake. But this word that they use in that isn't a lake. In fact, it's the word that means the great ocean. And we know that it was the ocean, or the Mediterranean Sea, actually. It's not really an ocean, I guess. We know that it was the sea, or the Mediterranean Sea, because there was a great tempest that arose that would be enough that would rock a boat. And you see, that kind of tempest or hurricane doesn't usually happen. They have storms, of course, on the Sea of Galilee, but it's not that big of a sea. So if you're out in the middle of the Sea of Galilee and a big tempest arises, which is rare to be that big of a tempest. These are experienced fishermen, right? And then they would be very experienced, and they'd just be on the lake, and they would be within 10 or 15 minutes of the shore. So it wouldn't be like these experienced fishermen would be all panicked and like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? And, history tells us that the boats that were on that Lake of Galilee, were just small little fishing boats. And we just think of Christ as in his type of little fisherman, and they got a little boat, a little canoe, and Jesus is laying down in a little canoe and he's sleeping. Well, how in the world? I understand it's a story and Jesus was purposefully sleeping to make a point, perhaps. But, you got 12 people and Jesus all crammed in this little canoe, and Jesus is sleeping, and the waves are crashing over the side, and he's getting all wet, and he's still sleeping. That's probably not what that's talking about. He was sleeping in a ship, and they were crossing the sea, as was Jonah. Jonah starts off at Jaffa and goes across the sea to Tarshish. So that's where Jesus actually went, because we can prove that, because it says when they finally they were about to wreck, and Jesus did this great miracle. Wouldn't be much of a miracle if they were out floating around in a little lake, right? But they're in a ship, and it's a big ship, and it's tossing and turning, and they're about to crash. And the miracle was that they got to the other side. That's exactly what happened in the sign of Jonah, or what happened to Jonah. There was a great tempest arose, and Jonah calmed the sea, and he made the trip, and he went to Tarshish. Well, interestingly enough, there's a little place, Tarshish, according to the scholars, is a place called Spain. Actually, all the way over to the gates of Gibraltar. And it's interesting, but there's southern Spain. If you look at the names of the towns and what they call themselves Gadarenes. And that's where it says Jesus went. They went to a place called, and Jesus preached to the Gadarenes. Well, the Gadarenes are an interesting group, because when they got there were all these tombs. And it says that the people didn't, they hadn't really even heard of Jesus. And when Jesus got on land, they're like, nah, we don't want you. Get out of here. They wouldn't repent. And there was a man that had a bunch of demons in him, and Jesus cast out the demons, and the demons all went into a big herd of pigs. Now remember, if Jews lived in Palestine, and that's where they went, there wouldn't be any pigs, because Jews don't even eat pigs. So they don't have herds of swine in Israel. That's just something that wouldn't be there. But this place that they went had pigs. Well, southern Spain is noted for the fact that they have all these pigs. To this day you go, and it's a delicacy. They eat pork, and they have herds and herds of pigs there. And there's also, in the southern part, there is a port, the port of Gadarenes, or the Gadarenes, where there's stories where Jesus actually was. I mean, ancient stories. There's still people do pilgrimage there in Spain. Most people don't know. I mean, we're completely ignorant today. We don't know about the fact that there's you can go to Spain and go to the spot where Jesus had. There's a place where there's even a footprint that they go and do pilgrimages to, where Jesus put his foot. They know that this is where Jesus went, and there's an actual church there that believes they are descendants of Jesus's family. So, anyway, what are the Gadarenes? Well, the Gadarenes is the children of Gad. And so, this tells us, because remember, Jesus says, I'm only sent to the lost children of the tribes of Israel. The lost. So, wherever Jesus went, he was preaching to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. And of course, as we've said, like in the spokes of the wheel, all around Europe, remember, Jude is down here, starts off in the lower part of down there in Babylon, because Daniel says that the lion is Babylon, the lion of the tribe of Judah. There's the Jews were taken to Babylon. So the southern area is for Judah. And as you go up around the wheel, you're going to find all of the different tribes. And in Numbers, it tells you how they were there in brigade, and Dan's armor, according to the Talmud and the ancient Jewish midrash and stuff. Dan had the serpent of a snake, a serpent, the sign or the emblem of a serpent. They had the flag, a banner with a serpent. And remember, there were two. Dan got one little area for inheritance, and then it was not big enough for him because he had ships. So they gave him another area up in the north. So one of Dan's emblems became the eagle, and one of them became the serpent. And Ephraim, or Joseph, had two kids, Ephraim and Manasseh, and they split his inheritance. And Joseph's sign was the bull or the ox. And it had one horn, and there's a prophecy about that in the Bible, and two prophecies about it, one in Genesis and one in Deuteronomy, about where the children of Israel will be in the latter days. So we know then that Ephraim ends up there in Britain, because they have on their flag, their emblem, they have a unicorn. And there is this tradition throughout, the Romantic era of the Europeans and the Merovingian line and all the great knights and emperors up there, where the knights were always after the unicorn, and there was these evil individuals that were coming to kill the unicorn. And it says that in this story, now that we think is just a story, right, that tells history, just like the Bible tells history, like Merlin and King Arthur and all this stuff, Arthur the Pendragon, right? And these stories literally are the truth, just like the Bible. They're telling true history, and within them are symbols that reveal great secrets. So at a certain point, it says they killed all the unicorns, and there isn't any more unicorns in the world. Well, that unicorn is that one horn, one king, one power on the ox, which today we think of as a horse, but that was the unicorn, was the ox. And that was Joseph. And so that was the authority of the holy bloodline through Jesus, that the Roman Catholic Church wiped off the face of the earth. And we're going to tell that story today, because that's the story of the Holy Grail. So We know then that the Bible tells us that Joseph of Arimathea was a very wealthy man. And it says that he was allowed to go and get the body of Christ and bring him down. And he buried him. And then the legends tell, and these legends are profuse throughout all of the European legends, the Celtic legends, and early Apocrypha. I mean, it's just everywhere. It's not like something somebody made up, but this is just everywhere, and you can do research on this. But Joseph of Arimathea had a ships, and he would go all around the world. He was a very wealthy man, and he had tin mines and silver mines and stuff. And one of the places that he went was Europe. And it says that he brought with him to Europe Jesus at one point. Jesus went with him. This is before Jesus, just right around the time when Jesus was doing his ministry. Jesus got in a boat with his uncle. Many call him his uncle. And they went, and the story and legend say that Joseph of Arimathea went to Glastonbury, England, and they started a church. They built a church. Well, that's, according to many people, the oldest Christian church in the world. And there is, today, you can go there, and there's a church, and there's, people pilgrimage to that place, and supposedly was tombs there, and everything that you would expect to find. And so we've got all this evidence and archaeology and proof and stories, but the world refuses to believe these stories. They've told us for so long that, none of this is true. Well, there's another story in Catholic. There's some infancy gospels and some other apocrypha that we have that tells the story that after Jesus died and was buried, that, remember, Jesus had resurrected Lazarus, which was the brother of Mary Magdalene and Martha. And because Lazarus was raised from the dead, this was a great proof that Jesus was the Messiah. I mean, he raised someone from the dead. And so when people saw him and heard his story, that means they could believe in Jesus. Well, Rome didn't like that. So right after the destruction of Jerusalem, there's stories that say that Rome put Mary Magdalene and Lazarus and some people on a ship, and they didn't give them any food and put them in a boat and put them into the Mediterranean and left and let them sail. And they figured, well, they didn't end up going out into the water and end up dying or something. Well, somehow they made this voyage without food and water. And they made this voyage and they landed in the south of France. And this is, it's without, it's impossible for me to put proofs and all of these things in this particular video, but we're just telling the story. And most of the stuff, you can go look it up real easy on the internet and find all these stories. Now, where they landed is a little place called Marseille. And to this day, you can go there, and there's the tomb of Mary Magdalene, and there's all the, they got a church there where they built for her, and everybody in that area, there's people that go there and tour that, and they pray and they weep, and they, this has been known that this was the place that Mary Magdalene went, and she brought with her her daughter Sarah, which was the daughter of Jesus Christ. And it says of Sarah that she was a dark-skinned woman. So this plays into what we've been talking about, who Mary Magdalene was. And so all of these legends aren't really legends, but you've been told that they're legends so that you'll just say, this is just a legend. We don't believe in this. There wasn't any Jesus. These are legends. See, let's just make a religion and go, oh, put a little mark on your forehead and take the wafer and abracadabra, and it's just a bunch of baloney, right? It's all legend. It isn't real. But remember, we found out yesterday in the last video that this is all the history. This is what they used to prove that Alexander the Great lived, or to prove that Caesar existed, it's just the history is what people write down. And with all history, like with we talked about the other day with the history of Vespasian. He was said to have healed people, and he went to the temple of Serapis, and the great pharaoh at that time, who was a Ptolemy, actually told Titus Vespasian, I'm going to make you king, and I'm going to give you the authority to reign. I've got control of this. And he told Titus, reach out your hand and heal that crippled and lame person. And Titus says, I can't heal people. Well, the Pharaoh there in Alexandria of Egypt, which was Jesus at the time, because the book of Hebrews says that Jesus was a prince and a high priest, a king of righteousness. Well, if Jesus was a king, somebody had to anoint him. And of course, the Bible tells us who anointed him, and that was his beloved sister wife, Mary Magdalene. She anointed him twice in the scriptures, once as king and once for his burial. But all of this is glossed over, and much of what's in the Bible. See, today we've got a Bible that almost all the Bibles come down to us from the Latin Vulgate, which was a Bible translation by a man named Jerome, who translated some late manuscripts that had been altered a little bit in certain places to promote Catholics. Just a few little places they threw something amiss or made to avoid some of the plainer translation, and they actually crossed out a couple of words in there so that we wouldn't know about Mary. The actual manuscripts, or the documents that or the original scriptures, have come down to us as the what is it called? I'm drawing a blank. What they call those? They call them the Receptus, the Holy Receptus. That is the oldest and the most accurate manuscript of the New Testament. But Jerome didn't use that. And so today, almost, if you look at the King James Version, it's actually a version. That's what it's called. It's not even called a translation. And they wrote it basically as a revision of the Latin Vulgate, which is done by the Catholic Church, which was translated by Jerome. But you see, there were other translations that used this Receptus, the Holy Receptus, the holy scriptures that were received as the ancient correct document. And a couple of people did that, but the first of these translations from the Holy Receptus was done by a man named Peter Waldo. And Peter Waldo is somebody that we're going to talk about because he's literally probably the most important person that you've never heard of. Remember what we said the other day? We've got Adam, and we've got the first 7 people down to Enoch, right? Adam and Seth and Enosh and Kenan and Mahalalel and Enoch. And that those first 7 men are the firstborn of all creation. And so therefore, these ended up, when they passed on, they were incarnated into the world to minister for those who would inherit salvation. And those are the 7 angels that stand before the Lord of the whole earth, which is Jesus. And so we identified that at every 1,000 years, these individuals would be incarnated, And so Adam was Michael, the archangel. And then Noah was Gabriel. And that was 1,000 years after Adam. And then another 1,000 years went by, and we saw Abraham. And another 1,000 years went by, and we saw David. And all of these were fathers. You know, Adam is, of course, father of all, and Noah was the father of all after the flood. And Abraham is the father of all, according to the Apostle Paul, and the father of faith. And then we said David, who had 1,000 wives, and Solomon, his son, ended up being the father of all the bloodlines of the world, and also the father of the lineage of Joseph, who is to be a multitude in the earth. And then we get down to the days of Christ, and we find that one of these 7 angels receives the key to the bottomless pit, and that was Peter, because Jesus gave him the keys. And upon this rock, the stone, I will gather my church. So then we've got 2 more to come. So the next one, which would be the 6th angel, would come in about the year 1000, somewhere between 1000 and 1100 AD. And we said that that's a Dark Ages. We don't know. All this history is obscure. We don't have any history, right? Well, yes, we do. We have all of these, what today they call myth and romance, the Arthurian legends, but people don't believe them. But where did, in the story of King Arthur, and we've got, a lot of people have heard of Lancelot. Not as many people actually read the story, probably don't even never heard of Percival. Percival is the prince who ends up going and acquiring the spear that is the same spear that pierced Jesus in the side. And these kings, King Arthur, were the Fisher Kings. They were a line of kings from Christ. How did they get there? How did they become the Fisher Kings? Well, as we said, Mary Magdalene took her son and her daughter Sarah to France, and she landed there at Marseille, France, at the southern end of France, at the beginning, or where the Rhine River empties into the Mediterranean. If you go up that river, you'll come to Montpellier, which is interesting because James Madison built a city in Virginia called Montpelier, which is also where Thomas Jefferson lived, and he built Monticello, and he believed, and they believed, that that was a sacred, they were telling us something by that. These were the founders of our country, and they believed that our country is fulfilling destiny. So we'll get back to that probably in another video, but back to this thing. So, that's where Mary Magdalene landed with her lineal children of Christ. Now, that then is how the Fisher Kings got into Europe. Well, what is the story? I'm absolutely certain you've never heard, because this story, though it's been told 1,000 times, it's probably gone in one ear and out the other. And it's the funniest thing. It's like the greatest story that's never been told, and yet it's been told 1,000 times before. Our history has been preserved for us. We know these things. And here's the story. In around the year 1100, there was a man called Peter Waldo. Peter Waldo was a man who had great wealth. You know, it's kind of like in the Talmud where it says Mary Magdalene had great wealth. And then we do a little digging, we find out she's the richest, most powerful woman in all the world. And Jesus becomes the high priest of Jerusalem there. And these guys or brother and sister because they inherit all the wealth of Queen Cleopatra, who is, over armies from Parthia, Iraq, all of Egypt and Africa. Probably the greatest wealth. The only other person that would have that kind of wealth would be Rome, and they're dividing it up like hungry little mongers, between the Senate, and they're dividing it up, and they're greedy little guys, but many of them were wealthy too. So here we've got this man that's very wealthy, and it says that he owned 169 towns and cities and villages along the Rhine. That means from Marseille up to Montpellier, all the way up to Lyons, however you pronounce it. And if you follow that river, it goes right on up into the Alps. And so therefore, we have the Waldensian Inquisition. And sometimes it's called the Albigensian Inquisition. The reason why is because Waldo that means the valley. And that's where we get Percival. Yeah. And when the Holy Roman Empire came in to destroy the Holy Bloodline, they knew they had to wipe out the Holy Seed. And they started the Great Inquisitions. Well, the first of the Great Inquisitions is to wipe out Peter Waldo. What Peter Waldo had done is, with all of his wealth, he gave it. He did some biblical studies, and he was of course he was a Christian. And he knew his heritage. And he understood what was at stake. And you can read all this story. Just look it up online and read about Peter Waldo. We had all this wealth, so he just gave it all to the poor. All to the people there. They call it the valley. There's probably 1,000 places in the world called valleys, right? 1 million. But this was the valley people, because it was the place where the kings were born, the Holy Grail. It's the stuff that all the legends are made out of, and that was the Rhine Valley we call it the Burgundy, and that area down there in southern France, the Languedoc. And so these people were the lineal descendants of Christ. And they held the Holy Grail. And he gave all of his wealth. He was the most wealthy king, and he gave all of his wealth, just gave it all to the people. And they loved him. And it wasn't just that either. They were actually considered pagans by the Catholic Church because, they were carrying on the Nazarene Christianity with the zodiac that we talked about and the pharaonic religion of Serapis. So they called them pagans, but, remember, they called them wizards. That's the wise ones. But you see how today it's been skewed because the Catholic Church wants you to believe that they're all bad and they're all pagans and everything, but they were really the true church. And so sometimes Peter Waldo was called Pierre, Valdez. It depends on what language. In Germany, he was called Vox. Pierre Vox. And, they had different names. In English, it's Voss. V-A-U-S-E. And here's the interesting things. And this is quite amazing to me, especially because doing the research, I discovered that particular line of kings, when they came, in Germany they were Vox. In France it was Valdi. In Latin it's Valley, or Val, or Percival. But in England it was Voss. And when they came to America, 1,000 years later, they changed their name. They spelled it V-O-S-E. And they landed in Boston. So that's an interesting part of the story. But going back to these individuals, he gave all of his wealth away, and his wife was very upset because he didn't want to leave her destitute. So he left her with a cottage and a little bit of money, a little stipend to live on for the rest of her life. He provided for his wife and his children. But all of we're talking probably billions of dollars, the wealth that came from Mary Magdalene and all of the power of these kings of the Languedoc, the Fisher kings, was in his hands, and he gave it all to the people. And then he actually had to become a beggar. He had nothing to eat. And he was on the streets begging, and his wife complained. He says, "Stop my husband from begging. It's embarrassing, you know." And so they made a law that says that he wasn't allowed to beg from anybody but his wife. So in order to eat for a while, he had to go and beg his wife for food, and she'd give him a little bread. But then he just went from town to town preaching. He ended up translating the first translation from the Holy Receptus Scriptures into the common language of that time. The first time it had been, because remember, at the time that the Latin Vulgate was written, people didn't even speak Latin anymore. So nobody could even read the Bible. So what he did was he spent solitude in prayer and in fasting and preaching and in piety, and he taught the people that the clergy had no power and that they could be priests themselves, that they had the right to speak to God themselves. They didn't need a priest. And he didn't believe in the transubstantiation, and he didn't believe in certain things. And so this made Rome very, very angry. And he was teaching all the people these things, and they were basically just more like Protestants today. They did not go by the Roman Catholic Church. And so it's a beautiful thing. He ended up translating the Bible in the common language of the Occitan language, which is the area down there in southern France called the Languedoc. A doc is that language that they spoke, the Occitan, and it was the first translation into the common language of the people. And it was because of Peter Waldo that we have Protestantism, that we have the other side of the coin. There was always these two groups. There was the Catholics and there was the Protestants, all the way back to this particular time, to the true religion that goes back to Mary Magdalene, that starts from the Languedoc, from the Rhine River and the Valley people. And so they're basically, because of his preaching, he traveled and he had no money. Just as Christ said, take no purse, don't, one sandals, one robe, don't worry about it, you'll be taken care of. And he knew that God would take care of him. And he translated the Bible into the common language and dispersed the scriptures into different places. And this kind of original true Christianity spread throughout Europe, all the way up into Austria, and eventually become, we got characters such as Huss, who made a translation of the scriptures for those people in the tradition of Peter Waldo. We've got Wycliffe. We've got all of these individuals that came later. That the Protestant Reformation came from the efforts of Peter Waldo. So in order to stamp that out, the Pope started an Inquisition and started murdering every man, woman, and child of this faith, of this Christian faith. Well, they spread all over the world. One group went to Scotland, to Ion, Scotland, and created an area where it was more or less a promised land, basically. They created a big church there. They sent out ministers and teachers. This is where we get Columbus. Columbo was this great preacher from this particular line. They started one up in England, in Whittingham or something, where they did the very same thing. They started more or less a college, taught people the ancient truth. They had the Holy Receptus, and they translated the scriptures into the common language there, and they spread the true Christianity. Well, the Catholic Church didn't like that, so they did the Inquisition, and what they were trying to do is murder all the bloodline. And this is where we get the Holy Roman Empire in 800 with Charlemagne. Charlemagne was a king who wasn't of this Fisher King Moravian bloodline, these pagans, right? He was, he got to power, basically, he was a mayor of the city. He wasn't of the lineal descent, but he was sort of put in power by the Romans. And at first they couldn't take the power from the king, from the fisher kings. So they set them up as the mayor of the city. As time went on, they got more and more power. The mayor got more and more power. And then Charlemagne was crowned. Charlemagne was one of these mayors that was put into power by the Pope. And they crowned him emperor. And then the Holy Roman Empire went with battles, waves and waves of battles, and they battled, and this fight went on and on and on, and drove the true Christians out into up and around England and Scotland and areas like that, until finally they set off in ships and went to America, and the Pilgrims. But that is the true history of the church. And then the story that's come down to us, this romance story of King Arthur. See, that's also about all this, because remember, in the story, in the legends, as they say, I don't like to call them a legend. I like to call them the story, because it's a true story. But in the story, there was a place called the Isle of the Blessed, and that's up into England. And the Avalon that you've heard in the great stories, and there was supposed to be a big lake and an island in the middle, with a bunch of mist around it, and in that isle was the Holy Grail. And this was the Grail because when Joseph of Arimathea came with Mary Magdalene and Sarah and Jesus' son, he brought with him all these relics and holy things that were, remember, the temple had been destroyed. So he brought with him many of these holy relics, and one of which was this cup that held the blood of Jesus. Because remember, Joseph of Arimathea was allowed to go and take the body of Christ down from the cross. And it says that he took a chalice and filled that chalice up with the blood of Christ and took it with him as a holy relic. And that, along with the spear that was used to pierce his side, were the two most holy relics that ended up going with him to France. And it was a sign that whoever had this spear and this Holy Grail was the true Fisher King. And so it ended up that the Grail and the spear ended up on the Isles of the Blessed in Avalon. And there was this knight that was commissioned to protect it. Well, the story goes that this great knight got careless one day, and the Romans came up and snuck in, and while he was sleeping or something, and grabbed the spear and struck his side with it. And at that point, he ran off with the spear. And so the enemy had the great spear, or the sword. And so sometimes it's called a great sword. But it's really, we don't know if it was a dagger or it was a spear, but it was some kind of a thing like that. And so for a period of time then, it didn't kill him, but this, the keeper of the Holy Grail, he goes back and he's got this wound and it won't heal. And he feels like he's going to die, and he's in pain, and he's in agony, and he's repentant, and he knows he did wrong, and he was careless, and it was because this is so precious, right? The Holy Grail is the holy bloodline, and the Fisher Kings cannot rule without that spear, because that's what's going to protect them. And of course, it's got connotations that are deeper than that. But this is the story that we have. So one day, a young man comes along. This is Percival. And he comes along, and he's just a young man, very, like a teenager, and he's pretty interesting kid. He's very innocent, but he doesn't know what's going on. He didn't know that he'd come along and found the Isles of the Blessed, and he didn't realize that there was a law because they had built this great temple there. And it was a very holy temple. And they had made a law that you could not hunt anywhere near that temple. There was a certain area called Paradise. And so all the all the creatures that were there, the birds and the animals, could not be killed because it was a place of peace and love. Well, Percival didn't know this, and he was just a young man, and he had this bow and an arrow, and he's out hunting, and he wanders into this area, and he sees a swan in the air, and he pulls back his bow, and he shoots the swan, gets him dead on, and the swan drops. Well, one of the knights sees this happen, and he's like, who in the world would desecrate this holy temple by killing an animal in this presence? And he ran over to Percival, and he sees this young man. He says, what are you doing? What did you do? And Percival says, well, I don't know. I'm just killed a swan, don't people hunt, don't we need food? And the great knight says, well, yes, but this is a holy place. You don't do this here. Have you no shame? And he says, well, I didn't know. And he hung his head, and he, kind of seemed sad. And he said, well, what are you doing here? What do you want? And he said, well, I've come to become a knight. And I'm going to protect the Holy Grail. And his arrogance, almost as if, who are you, this young man? You're not a knight. Go away, boy. You bother me, But Percival didn't dissuade him, He says, no, that's my destiny. I'm going to protect the Holy Grail. That's who I am. That's my destiny. And the priest says, well, all right, I'll tell you what. Would you like to come in and observe communion and hear this song in the choir? And Percival says, well, I don't know. I don't really want to hear song, I just came to be a knight. And he says, well, you can't just come in here and be a knight. So anyway, he finally talks him into going in there, and he sits down. He allows him in just because of his courage. There's something about the young man. So he sits down, he listens to the whole thing, and he's still a little arrogant and doesn't realize what's going on. But in the end, he finds out that the protector of the Holy Grail's got the wound, and they need this sword back. And Percival says, I'm going to go get the sword. Don't you worry. And he takes off. So he goes, and now as he's going along, there's these witches that were trying to keep any of the great knights from finding the spear, because now it's in the hands of the Holy Roman Empire, and they've got the power, and they're making the progress, and they're conquering the world because they've got the sword. So they've got this witch casts a spell on everybody that goes through, and they get to this certain place, and they think, oh, it looks like a paradise. And there's girls down in the water, and they're bathing, and there's dancing, and there's, wine and music, and it lures them all in. Well, nothing can deter Percival. He knows his mission. So he comes up, and they offer him, to come down to the garden, have some fun. And he says, no, thank you. Not interested. I'm going to get I'm going to go get the great spear and give it back to where it belongs. And they're like, who are you? You can't, you need to come on down here and have some refreshment on your journey. Well, he refuses, and all of a sudden he gets past them, and he goes on, and he meets this king that's got this spear. And he says, I've come to take the spear. And he says, oh, this young man says he's going to take my spear, He says, you idiot. And so he takes the spear, and he throws it at him. Well, the spear goes and stops in midair right above Percival's head, and then goes around him. Percival reaches out and grabs it, and he planks it into the earth, and he says, I've got it. And all of a sudden, this illusion of this paradise just sort of crumbles and falls away. And he takes the spear back to the Isle of the Blessed. And they make him the protector. And a holy dove comes down out of heaven. And this beautiful princess that was turned into a witch, he blesses her and puts water on her head and says, I heal you. And he's redeemed, and you're redeemed. And then this other protector of the Holy Grail, he takes the end of the sword and touches his wound, and it's healed. And this pain is gone. He says, you're redeemed, but you are no longer the protector of the Holy Grail. God has commissioned me, and I am going to protect it. But at that moment, the line of the Fisher Kings was healed. So it's a beautiful story, and there's a lot more that goes to that, and we'll get into that in the next video, as I'm now over an hour. But boy, stay tuned, friends, because the story is amazing. And you're going to find out things that you never, in your wildest dreams, and I don't mean nightmares, I mean in your dreams, you couldn't have hoped for more. Because we're going to prove historically, and I don't mean like, do you believe that there was a Caesar? Do you believe that there was a Pharaoh? Do you believe that there was yeah, it's in our history books. Yeah, of course, nobody's questioning any of this, right? Well, what we're going to find out is that you don't have to question anything else either, that we have taken only as a matter of faith up until now. But this great truth is going to be revealed, and people are going to find out that our Lord Jesus is real. And Mother Mary, she's real. And there's just so much more. We'll get back into it tomorrow. It's David Vos. We'll see you again. Have a good one.